Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sheila Subramanian. My pronouns are she, her, and I will be the host for today's session. So in addition to my hosting duties, my day job is the Senior Director of the Future Forum, a consortium that is backed by Slack and that focuses on data and dialogue about leadership, technology, and talent in this digital-first work environment. And today, I am joined by 6 illustrious academics to speak about DEB, diversity, equity, and belonging in the workplace. So to start, let's clarify. Why DEB? You may have heard different terms to describe representative and inclusive work environments, from D&I to I&D to DEI. Diversity is the difference in the experience and perspectives between people. Equity is about access. It's about putting systems in place that are free from bias and giving people the opportunity to have the same access to outcomes. And belonging is about creating an environment where people feel valued and heard within their organizations. So, given the state of today's world, it's important for us to understand the connection between all 3 of these terms. And as a woman of color, I have struggled with belonging my entire life. So much so that I spent my academic years studying systemic racism and the ways in which governments could address it. I believed that structural bias could be fixed with a few government policies and would get easier as I progressed in my career and could influence more change. Now, nearly 20 years later, there's not one fix. It's not just on the government, and it's actually gotten tougher as I've grown in my career, both as an individual as well as a leader. And with the onset of the global pandemic nearly 8 months ago, these structural barriers have only gotten worse for many underrepresented groups. So earlier this month, we launched something called the Future Forum. We launched something called the Remote Employee Experience Index. And what we found in that index was we wanted to better understand the impact of remote work on knowledge workers across the world. The purpose of the index is to compare the experience of working from the office versus working from home across 5 different elements. We took each of these elements and asked respondents to score them on a scale from much better to much worse than working in the office, with the midpoint line you're seeing right here being about the same as working in the office. And according to the research, what we found was that Black, Latinx, and Asian respondents are less likely than white counterparts to agree to the questions: I am treated fairly at work, my manager is supportive when I need help, and I can count on my coworkers to help me when things go wrong at work. But it's not all negative news. There's one specific area where non-white employees have had a more positive experience. Black, Latinx, and Asian employees feel a stronger sense of belonging when they work from home relative to the office and compared to their white colleagues. This data leads to many questions for us, including why is remote work maybe helping level the experience? And are we seeing the extent to which the office was once a place of exclusion? There's a lot that we need to better understand. So 8 months into this massive, uncontrolled work experiment, now is the moment for us to rethink how we're doing work. It's not just about promoting ERGs and diversity training. It's about building practices in the heart of our companies that drive inclusivity. And as stated by recent research by Edelman, our employees are expecting and trusting business leaders to be part of the solution. Contrary to my experience nearly 20 years ago, the government is no longer a trusted institution. So that's why we're all here today. In this conversation, we'll focus on 2 key themes: how to build an anti-racist organization and the future of how teams should operate. And we hope that you leave our conversation today with practices that you can take back and implement at your own organization. Okay, so this is the fun part. Let me introduce our special guests. For today's conversation, please welcome Evan Apfelbaum, Denise Lewin Lloyd, Brian Lowry, Quinetta Roberson, Sherry M.B. Thatcher, Ella F. Washington. We are very, very excited to hear from you. Okay, so today's agenda is that we're going to spend the next 30 minutes on a series of 5-minute rapid presentations where each speaker will give an overview of their findings and research. We'll then take a quick break and spend 45 minutes in 2 smaller breakout sessions focused on the topics I discussed earlier. And you are more than welcome to ask questions via Zoom chat during both of the breakouts. We'll do our best to surface your questions to the moderators, and our hope is to answer as many as we can. Okay, with that, I'll pass it over to Mark Rivera, who will lead our research presentations. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Sheila. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Rivera. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a staff researcher here at SLAC. I'm personally excited to ground today's conversations in the collective wisdom of a truly outstanding group of researchers. Speakers in this group have drawn on social psychology, sociology, small groups research, and other disciplines to help advance our knowledge about a topic that could hardly be more important to the future of work, understanding how we all work together. Our hope is that the existing research shared in this session will help us explore the subsequent 2 discussion threads, the future of teams and the anti-racist organization, 2 areas where we know there's a lot yet to be learned and addressed. While we won't be taking direct questions during this session, do feel free to post thoughts and comments in the Zoom chat. We'll be keeping an eye on those conversations and grabbing topics that can be raised in the discussion panels. Each presenter will have 5 minutes to share a big idea about how we work together. Starting us off is Brian Lowry, who is joining us from Stanford University.
Great, thanks, Mark. It's great to be here. I'm Brian Lowry. I'm an organizational behavior professor at Stanford University, and my basic discipline is social psychology. And what I want to share with you all is a way of thinking about equity. So diversity, equity, and belonging is the way you talk about it at SLAC, and I want to provide some insight into work that I've done that sheds light on how we think about equity. So when we think about equity, certainly from a psychological perspective, we generally think in terms of relative differences, right? So we think that companies or groups are fair or not, and that advantage and disadvantage typically describe the same thing, that is unfairness. So let me give a quick, let's see here, a picture to demonstrate what I mean. So in this case, if you think about this race, there is inequity here, right? So people aren't starting at the same place. And so this is often the way that people will talk about inequity, that everyone doesn't have the same opportunity to succeed because of where they start. And here, what you see is you could talk about the person who's closest to the finish line as being advantaged, or the person who's furthest away as being disadvantaged. But really what you're describing is the whole situation here. You're describing something about this system, I would call it. Or you could think of this as an organization. Different people in the organization are in a place where it's easier for them to succeed or harder for them to succeed because of barriers they face, or where they've started from, or resources they've had. So the system itself, the company, the group, in this little case, this example, the race is unfair. And it's unfair because there are differences between people that affect their ability to succeed. And so this is how we typically talk about inequity, right? What's the difference between people? And I'm gonna suggest, and research I've done, and I won't get into the particulars. If you're interested, you can go to my website and see it. But I have a lot of studies that provide evidence that this is not really the way that people think about inequity. This is not how people represent it. So really what people do is they think in terms of absolute differences. What does that mean? What it means is inequality is a feature of people and groups, not the system, not the company. So let me go forward here. Oh, sorry, a little bit too far. So fairness in this way of thinking is about individuals having what they deserve. So when you look at the picture now, we have a starting line, and that changes how people think about what's going on in that race. So now, where before it was just an unfair company, an unfair race, Now you can point to different individuals in the situation and say they have too much or too little. So if you see the person is at the starting line, what that looks like is that person is where they should be. Now there's someone behind them, and that person is disadvantaged, and there's someone in front of that person, and that person, she might be advantaged, right? So now we can separate advantage and disadvantage and locate it in particular people, right? So in this case, so imagine that where there's a starting line, the person is at the starting line. Imagine there's only the person at the starting line and let's say the woman behind the starting line. If you wanted to fix that, the way you would fix it probably is by moving the woman behind up to the starting line, right? Because the person at the starting line is where they should be. Now imagine that you fixed it instead by moving the person at the starting line back. Now that person would feel like you've done them a disservice, you've treated them unfairly, even though they would recognize that the situation has become more equal. They still would feel like the way you've done that has created more unfairness in the system. And the reason this is important is because I think that the way that people think about inequity is with the starting line. And that starting line, and this is what's important, doesn't really exist. It's something we construct. It's an idea we create. So we decide what people should have, where people should be, and then we compare everyone to that, right? And that's what I mean by absolute differences. We have an idea of what is right, and then we compare everyone to that point of what is right. And if they're above that point, they're advantaged. If they're below that point, they're disadvantaged. Here's how this shows up in terms of race. So when we think about the context, the word white privilege, really what we're doing is saying white people have more than they should. White people are ahead of the starting line. Now, as a white person, that might not be your experience at all. You might feel like what's going on is you're at the starting line, and you might recognize that Black folks or other people of color are behind the starting line and think that's not fair. But if you think that a remedy moves you back, you will also think that's unfair, even though that remedy reduces inequity. So the reason that it's important to understand how we think about inequity is it changes how we respond to attempts to rectify it. So if you believe that you have what you should, it's harder to accept a policy that seems to take something from you to help someone else, right? But it's important to keep in mind that the reality is that starting line doesn't exist, right? That we're all truly in this situation on the left-hand side where there's just inequities among us, that the inequity exists in the system, and that if we want to create inequity, you have to find ways of giving everyone the same opportunities. And sometimes that means pushing people up, and sometimes that means pulling people back. And both those things are ways to produce more equity. So again, what I would say about this is it really shows up in the way we think about where we are. Where are we in the organization? What can we demand or expect of the organization? And what is our commitment to equity? And sometimes that commitment requires us to take a little bit less in service of a more just, a more equitable organization. So with that, I'll stop and I will pass it over to Sherry.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was fantastic. I'm Sherry Thatcher. I'm a professor of business administration at the University of South Carolina. And like everyone else, I'm just thrilled to be here and be part of this conversation. So I'd like to talk about belonging by accepting uniqueness, and doing that by talking about team diversity. There's been a lot of research on team diversity and a lot that is focused on surface level characteristics such as gender, age, race, or some combination of those factors. And we know that there are performance and creativity implications. And unfortunately, the majority of the research has shown that there's negative effects for performance and creativity because there happens to be a lot of conflict in these types of teams. There's misunderstandings and frustration. However, some research has also shown that there's diverse teams can perform very positively and have high levels of creativity, especially those that engaged in information elaboration or information sharing. So they're able to harness the benefits of that diversity. So what's the difference? Why do we have some teams that succeed and some teams that don't do very well? And I'm very interested in this question because of my personal experiences. I grew up white on the island of Kauai, in the state of Hawaii. And there were very few white people where I grew up. And there was a lot of discrimination and bullying against white kids. And it was very confusing to me because my friends were all of different races. But there was also a large number of people who really didn't like me only because I was white. And so at a very young age, I realized that understanding diversity and how people get along is not about similarities and differences. It goes much deeper than that. And it's about the willingness to see and understand one another for who they are. So I became interested in this idea, which I did some research on with some colleagues, of identity comprehension. So if you think about a team and you look at how people want to be seen within that team, do others see them that way? Or are they seen for just their outward characteristics? So identity comprehension is the extent to which individuals on a team accurately understand the identities that are important to the others on the team. For example, when I'm working on a research team, I want people to know that my areas of expertise are diversity, identity, conflict, fault lines. I want them to know I'm hardworking and conscientious. But I also want them to know that I'm from Hawaii, that I've lived for a number of years in Asia and worked in Micronesia, that I have 2 college-age children, that I play tennis. Why does it matter? It matters because it makes me feel like I belong to the team and that others see me for who I want to be seen as, and I'm unique. I have something different that I bring to the team and I'm accepted for that as well. It also matters because it sets the foundation for expectations. And it matters because it helps us avoid the detrimental effects of conflict, can help us avoid stereotypes, and can pave the way for us to better share information in a collaborative way. So what does this mean for virtual teams? I actually think that it's an opportunity for intentional inclusion. I was really actually surprised by what Sheila presented at the beginning because I was like, oh, it basically says what I think would happen, which is sometimes people feel more free to express their identities or who they are in a virtual environment. And so managers and leaders, we now have the opportunity to create that environment. We can ask people to share small pieces of their identity that over time fosters the sense of belonging. So I thank you again for this opportunity to share my research, and I really look forward to hearing what others have to say and the conversations that we're going to have after this. Thank you. I need to move on to Evan.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you to the entire SLAC team for organizing this important event. And you know, what I'd like to talk about when Mark told me that the theme was sort of the way we work together, I was immediately where my mind went was Kathy Phillips' research, who's been a mentor for me and a number of others I know on this call. And you know, it's interesting when I think about what we know about diversity. And when we look to the science and we say, well, what do we know about how diverse groups, diverse spaces affect people's behavior? How does it really change the behavior? You know, one of the most consistent and reliable conclusions we can draw from this research is that, as Kathy says, diversity makes people work harder. Socially and cognitively, and I'll unpack that in a second. And I think what I hope to offer today in talking through this little nugget of research is a way to think about diversity, not as a good thing or a bad thing, but what does it do in a consistent way to how people act? And so it creates friction, and it creates friction in the following way. So how does it make people work harder socially? If you imagine being in a social environment that, for example, is racially diverse, it pushes people to perhaps think a bit more carefully before speaking. We want to be culturally sensitive. We don't want to offend. Certainly, people don't want to appear racist. Generally, people want to speak and act in ways that would be deemed as socially acceptable. But there's also a cognitive piece to that, right? Because when you see somebody who looks different, it's almost like a pinch or a prompt to say, well, maybe this person has different opinions than me, or different perspectives, or life experiences, or different information. And what I'd argue is that the hard work that, so this mental hard work that diversity pushes us to do, actually has implications for a lot of the context of face in diverse spaces at work. So one of the questions is friction advantageous? Is it good that diversity makes us work harder? And what I would argue is that, as Sherry notes, there is really a sort of a mixed bag when you look at the effects of diversity on performance. But in those contexts where we see diversity improves decision making, improves performance, I would argue that it's in large part because of how it pushes people to work harder and think in different ways. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I think of, Sam Summers' research looking at how juries deliberate in Michigan jury pools. Sam took racially diverse juries, so black and white jurors, and compared them to all white jurors, and just videotaped and examined how they deliberated over the same video recorded case. And what he found was the diverse juries considered a wider range of perspectives. They deliberated for longer. They made fewer factual inaccuracies when recalling case facts. And what's really interesting about these data is that it's not because in these data that the black jurors on the racially diverse juries are adding new perspectives and opinions. It's because the white jurors on those racially diverse jurors are all of a sudden prompted to act differently. They're all of a sudden questioning their assumptions. They're digging deeper into case facts. They're thinking about things from different angles. And so there is this systemic effect on how diversity pushes everyone to think a bit more deeply. There's other data suggesting that diversity reduces conformity, or the tendency to yield to majority opinion, because people feel more comfortable questioning assumptions, more comfortable saying, I feel differently about this. There's evidence that diversity can improve accuracy in pricing assets in trading markets. Again, because they're less likely to copy the mistakes of other people. And there's another side to this, of course, and this is really critical to understand why it's complicated, is that what we know about people is that we don't always like to work hard, and we don't like to learn new behaviors and be pushed to be stretched in new routines. And so what happens is, even though diversity pushes us to work harder and differently, working harder and differently does not always feel good. And so you have situations where a diverse team might outperform a group of similar others, but it's actually the group of similar others that is feeling better or is feeling more confident about how they did. And that makes it really hard for people, for managers and organizations, to sort of recognize the true value that diversity brings. Because again, diversity pushes us to work hard, but we don't always like to work hard. The friction and effort that goes into diversity doesn't always feel good. And so it makes it more difficult to discern where and how diversity is valuable for us and for organizations. So I think the big question for leaders, given this, is, well, how can we introduce challenging discussions, new routines? How can we introduce this sort of friction in a way that helps all people appreciate that value? And that's really sort of the million-dollar question when it comes to this. And I don't have much time left, but what I'll argue is that it has to do with getting everyone to understand that diversity provides an opportunity for learning about yourselves, about others, about society. And in doing so, it helps organizations adapt to disruptions like COVID and remote work, adapt to societal events like everyone witnessing George Floyd's killing, and grow. And so I think it is this sort of framework that allows people to get through the tough parts of diversity and understand the way in which it is valuable. And I'm The final point that I'll just save for the second discussion is really more of an implementation comment. And in order to do this in organizations, what we often see is that the efforts need to be built in and weaved into the strategy and not bolted on. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that in the second session. But I'll end there, and Quinetta will be next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Quinetta Roberson, and I want to thank the SLAC team for including me in this. I have a sense of belonging, but also I use this as an opportunity, not necessarily to just convey some things that are on my mind and to share those ideas with you, but to really push my thinking about where we can go. So what I want to talk briefly about today is, as we think about belonging, what have we done, what are we doing, and what couldn't we do in the future? And when I look at, we think about, we have to start with inclusion before we can get to belonging, because we saw this change in terminology somewhere around 2005. And people were saying, we're trying to create inclusive environments. And part of the struggle was to understand, what did that mean? And over time, researchers have identified the experience of inclusion as having a sense of uniqueness, a value for who you are, and also a sense of belonging, that you feel connected to something. At the same time, we've tried to understand, how do we do that, right? How do we make people feel a sense of uniqueness and a sense of belonging? And we have, if we think about creating cultures for that, there's the practices and there's the leadership. Well, research on practices hasn't necessarily advanced that much over the last few years. What we've done is more kind of put things in place and see what works. And so we've done, learning and education initiatives, thinking about, Sheila mentioned training. She also mentioned ERGs. Does that help create feelings of inclusion? And we've also done, staffing initiatives and those kinds of things. But at the same time, leaders, we focused on leadership and what leaders can do. And we have research that suggests that leaders can do a number of things that, in being more relational, that they can create feelings of inclusion. And so things like just what's considered to be diverse talent management, right? Having diversity, realizing differences, and having those differences present in an organization. Having person-role fit, right? And so Sherry mentioned not just valuing someone for their group membership, but more so what they bring to the table or what their contribution can be. We also know that to create, more inclusive leadership is about communication. There's research on fairness that says that we need to be fair in that we have to communicate with employees. We have to be honest and open and transparent, but we also have to treat them with respect and dignity. And in that communication process, they'll feel valued and connected. And then we also have to give them a sense of agency, right? Not that we are helping them, but we are actually being a support in order for them to realize their goals. And what's interesting about that is I'm doing a lot of work now on allyship. And there are a number of people who say, for example, I just had an example personally where someone said, I'm going to be an ally to you. And I thought, okay, I didn't ask for that. I got this one, but the person just said, no, I'm going to be an ally for you. And so there was this more of this help, right? That I needed that rather as a sense of agency. But if in being inclusive leaders, that's part of the recognizing of people's value that they bring to an organization, to let them tell us how they can meaningfully contribute. And so in thinking about creating a culture of belonging, we have to think how to do this, not just one-on-one with employees, but on a larger scale. And what my research to date shows that there are 4 kind of pillars of that. One is the understanding and valuing differences in terms of, are people, do we recognize those differences? Do people experience practices and policies the same way, as Brian mentioned? Are they equitable? And do people have an opportunity to participate in decision making? But contrary to that individual focus, we have to do it with a focus on the team, thinking about team skill sets and thinking about collaboration. So not necessarily what does one person bring, but how do we activate the team in order to create synergies in something new? We also have to realize about skill utilization. How can we have a focus on performance and people allowing us to people telling us how they want to contribute and meaningfully contribute? But then how we can make sure that people have voice in the work that we do. And voice, not just in terms of agreeing with us as leaders, but also if they want to debate or if they offer criticism. And so there has to be almost that balance of benefit, but also being able to take the negative. And in the interest of time, what I want to do for our discussion going forward is to say that Sherry mentioned being able to count on our coworkers. And I was talking about the role of leaders, but there's a role for team members as well. So how do we translate these 4 pillars into something that team members can actually do? What do peers do to create that sense of belonging? And I think that leaves us some that's a gap and leaves us some space to really explore going forward in the future. So with that, I will go to the next slide and turn it over to Ella.
Thank you, Quinetta. Hi, everyone. My name is Ella Washington. I'm a professor of practice at Georgetown University. And I'm also the founder of Ellavate Solutions consulting firm. And so I have the unique position of having both a career in academia as well as in practice. And so I love being in spaces like this. You know, there weren't always spaces like this where we could talk outwardly about research and practice in the same space and have the opportunity to learn from each other. So it's super excited to be here. Today, I want to talk about DEI training. And so Quinetta and Sherry have both started the conversation and mentioned DEI training. And I often get asked by C-suite leaders, you know, what is the quick fix that we can do to improve DEI? And so, you know, this question itself oftentimes makes me visibly squirm because the thought that DEI is a journey is not a new one, but yet the number one thing I'm consistently asked is how do we get to the quick wins in DEI? And we want to see action now. And so this question itself tells me we're missing the larger point of DEI as a journey. And the most common attempt I see at this quick fix is training. And, you know, training is a part of a strong strategic workplace diversity management program. In fact, research over the past 40 years tells us a lot about what training can do and what it can't do under certain circumstances. I rely on key takeaways from a meta-analysis by Bezrikova and colleagues that studied more than 216 independent training samples. Additionally, I know my colleagues and others such as Quinetta have ongoing research on this topic. And so one area that I've noticed research and practice don't seem to communicate that much about is kind of on the outcomes of training and whether or not it actually works. And so I've had the pleasure of leading corporate trainings at all levels. And my HR and learning and development clients are often shocked at some of the best practices that I share. And unlike many elements of DEI strategy, training, I think, is the most popular because I believe it's one of those few tangible things that we can wrap our minds around in this difficult work of doing these big things such as dismantling systematic inequalities. But again, I have seen this constant push and pull between research and practice and knowing that, you know, we don't always consider what we know from a research perspective. So I just want to share kind of 3 main observations. One main observation is that, you know, research tells us that purpose of a training being clear at the outset is critical to its success, and the most effective trainings target both awareness and skills development. However, many people bring in trainers for workshops that are designed for awareness building, but the organization assumes that it will lead to actually behavior change. And so for me, I ask my clients 3 questions when designing training to make sure that we're getting at the true purpose of the training. So what do you want people to know and think about as a result of the training? What is the experience you want people to have during the training? What do you want them to actually feel? And what do you want them to do as a result of the training? What type of behavioral change do you want to see? The second observation I have is that when organizations embark on a new DEI strategy, training is the first line of defense. It's the first thing that they want to do. While I'm always happy to conduct trainings, I do get a bit frustrated when I ask them what their plans are for after the training, or how does training fit into their larger DEI efforts. And so research is really clear that training is most effective when it is complementary to other diversity initiatives and is part of overall strategy, as well as conducted over time instead of in one-time efforts. So if we're serious about the purpose of trainings leading to behavioral change, it can't exist in a silo, and it must be strategically integrated into the larger culture of the organization's efforts. My third observation is around performative wokeness versus having opportunities to fail and learn during the training. And so many times L&D teams develop trainings based on a topic of interest, and it might be based off of a current event such as Black Lives Matter, as we've seen this year. But when they get in the training, I often see leaders trying to convince me how woke they are and how far they have come along their own individual journeys. In fact, in many trainings, I ask a poll, how comfortable are you with workplace discrimination conversations such as gender, race, sexual orientation, age, etc. Almost always the leaders rate themselves at a 4 or a 5 and explain how great they are in these conversations. But later on in the training, when I have them do scenarios where they actually have to manage these types of conversations, they often pull back and they fail to be able to do that. And so in closing, in the interest of time, there are major takeaways we know from a research perspective in terms of what makes DEI training effective versus what doesn't make it effective. But until we start applying those best practices, we'll continue to see organizations kind of struggle with creating trainings that actually lead to behavioral changes. Thank you. And I will turn it now over to the next presenter, Denise.
Hello, everyone. My name is Denise Lewin Lloyd, and I'm an associate professor of business administration and the associate dean for equity at the Geese College of Business. Like my colleagues, I'm delighted to be part of this important conversation. In my work, I focus on group composition and the impact of group composition on team and member outcomes. So today I'm going to be focusing on what I call building great teams. Great inclusive teams in particular, and share a few of my insights. So the punchline is that structure matters, and it's not as easy as 1, 2, 3. When we think about moving from homogeneity to diversity, one changes everything. Now that seems like a bold statement, but I will say that even one dissimilar other really represents a qualitative shift in the context of the group. And as my esteemed colleagues, especially Evan, has discussed, diversity really can promote expression of unique perspectives and dissenting perspectives that help us be more innovative and more creative and make better decisions. And the best part to me is that those unique perspectives don't only come from the minority, from the person who's different, but majority group members also share more unique information in the presence of diversity. So diversity really impacts everyone. But being a solo can make it harder to advocate for diversity, to advocate for similar others. In my work, I find that solos are more likely to be concerned that advocating for similar others might be seen as illegitimate favoritism. So they may support similar others less. Thus, increasing diversity can ironically undermine diversity. So one changes everything, but one is certainly not enough. Which leads us to 2, but that must be the solution. The solution must be 2. The saying is 2 heads are better than 1. We've all heard that. And it seems intuitive that 2 would be better. However, it's not that easy. 2 is perhaps more complicated. In spite of the recent push to do things like in California, have at least 2 women on boards by 2021, we may not fully understand the context. As a solo, an individual stands out, but as a duo, the category stands out. A member of a duo can be more identified with their identity group. Instead of being Jennifer, you're one of the women, and 2 can be seen as interchangeable. So funny anecdote that Sandra Day O'Connor says, as the only woman on the Supreme Court, she received an excessive amount of attention. But when Ruth Bader Ginsburg joined, she was very happy for it. At least once a term, the two were confused by attorneys presenting before the Supreme Court with one another. And despite the fact that they hail from very different political backgrounds and don't look anything alike, they were called each other's names. In my work, I find that a female member of a duo is more stereotyped as feminine than a solo. And to the majority, two may be seen as a separate group that you don't have to worry about because they have each other. So two is more complicated than we might think, which brings us to three. I don't know if three is a magic number, but there's definitely power in three. In geometry with 3 points, we describe a plane, and that's what makes things like tripods and three-legged stools so sturdy. In work looking at women on boards of directors, they found that with three, they became more individuated. That's kind of a fancy way of saying that people saw them as the individuals they are more when there were at least three of them. Three is also powerful because it's an odd number, and there's some work that looks at the full size of the group in odd and even groups, and finds that odd-sized groups can be more impactful in the sense that it's harder to create two equal-sized factions. So when I presented this image, your eyes may have been drawn to the 3 blue dots, the power of 3, but I'd like to draw your eyes to this set of the 3 within the group. If we as leaders have the opportunity to break down our groups, we could think about breaking them into odd numbered groups, in part because if we don't believe that we have the power to create these factions, we have to work harder, to go back to what Evan was saying, to understand the other person, and if only to try to convince them, right, to come to my side. So I presented in short order just some basic facts that I found through my work around how our structure really can impact the dynamics in teams. And even though it's not as easy as 1, 2, 3, there are steps that we can take to improve our context, and it's certainly work that's worth doing. Thank you.
Excellent. We already have so many great ideas to build on in the upcoming conversations. To catch up on time, we're going to transition right into them. Through the magic of Zoom, we're going to save you all the commute to the sessions. You will automatically be taken there in their Zoom channel. If you need to grab a glass of water or anything on the way, please do so, but we'll be getting started very quickly. Thank you.
All right. I think that everybody is back in the main session. Apologies, Quinetta, we stopped you mid-sentence in the Future of Teams breakout, but hopefully we can get some final thoughts from you as a follow-up. So thank you again to everyone for joining today's session. And a very big thank you to Evan, Denise, Quinetta, Brian, Sherry, and Ella for leading the conversations. And thank you to Janae for moderating one of our sessions. So as a next step, we will welcome your feedback for this session, and we'll share a link to the survey in the Zoom chat as well as in our post-event email. And before you go, I want to remind everyone that next Tuesday is Election Day. And as we think about building more inclusive workplaces, please give your teams the space and time to vote and volunteer on this special day. All right, with that, thank you again for joining us today. You'll hear from us shortly, and be well.
Thank you very much.